Hey everyone, welcome back to part 3 of the Kurzweil K2000R repair and overview series. So this is the unit that I've been working on throughout the video here. This is my K2000R, the Janus hardware revision version. And this is the second one I have. This is actually a Kelvin version. So I have both of these here in this video because we're going to be primarily looking at the engine board, which is really the most interesting portion of these units in terms of upgrades and hardware architecture in general with them. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So in this video, we will look at the engine board, specifically between the Janus and Kelvin versions to show the differences there. And then we're going to be working on various different upgrades with this board. So we're going to upgrade the firmware. So even though both versions take the exact same, or both revisions of this take the exact same firmware version, the actual ROMs are different due to the different hardware architecture between the two. Besides that, we're also going to look at the setup ROMs. So the setup ROMs are key to, especially when you add on the additional modules like the orchestra module I have in this one over here. What I'll probably do is move that orchestra module from that unit over to this one, because this one's ultimately the one that's going to go back on my rack. And since I have that module in here, and I'm not going to be using this unit, I'll put it in this one. So I'll discuss what is necessary for that in terms of both moving the module over and the setup ROM changes you need to make. Besides that, we will upgrade the sample RAM, so it just takes standard 30-pin SIMs. I'll talk about that briefly. There's a handful of other programmable devices on here too that have version revisions, so we'll talk about that. And then really just finally we'll take a look at like I said, the hardware between the two engine boards and the differences between the two different revisions of it, and just discuss what's on there and take a closer look at what Kurzweil was using to make these things run. So we'll dive right into it. I'll pull the engine board out of both, and then we'll start talking about those. Okay, so here is the two engine boards out of both the Janus and Kelvin versions of the K2000R. So as I mentioned before, to identify what version you have, the easiest way is if it powers on, just check the screen when it comes up. If it is a Janus version, you will see a J at the end of the firmware version, when the actual device boots on the LCD. If there's no J there, it is a Kelvin version. So the next easy way is open it up. There's just some physical differences between the hardware. The primary difference that you can just look for is this chip back here, this VLSI custom ASIC. It actually says Janus on it, versus the Kelvin version will say Cal right at the end of the name right there. So you can look for that. That makes it pretty easy to detect between the two. So the next way to identify is in this section here between the two. You've got some changes. Mostly this chip count has gone down. So on the older Kelvin version, you got a handful of 74LS 541s and then 241s I believe in there. And down here you got some 245s. These are all octal line drivers, a lot of them 3-state logic, and they're just used to buffer data basically on the buses, to latch things on and off those buses. And for whatever reason, when they went to the Janus version, they were able to cut down the number of ICs that they have right here. Besides that, there's not too much differences between the two. All the physical connectors are in the same exact location, same with the back channel jacks as well. There's a couple small changes back here between the two versions for the memory management. I'll talk about these in a bit. And just a couple of little minor variations in there. Now in any 2000R chassis, you can place either engine board in there. The actual data that comes off the buses that actually goes back to the analog board at the bottom and everything there, it's identical. There's no differences between the two, and there's no differences in the way the two operate as well. Even though the actual EPROMs on them have a different version for Kelvin and Janus, the user interface is identical. There's no differences at all. So for whatever reason, during the life cycle of the K2000, they went from this Kelvin version of this ASIC down to the Janus version. So nobody really knows why. I'm sure people know why, but I haven't been able to find an answer why, in at least everything I've read. But like I said, it doesn't make any difference in the operation of the unit. So revision numbers. There is different revisions of these boards as well. At least I know for the Kelvin, because the Kelvin was around for much longer than the Janus was. And you'll find the revision number right behind this connector right here for the optional RAM expansion board. In this case, Rev C is the version that I have for this engine board. I looked in my other two Kelvin units as well, and they both have Rev C. So everything I have is Rev C. Now, on the actual Janus board, Rev A is what I have here. There may be later revisions, I'm not sure, but you will find some minor modifications in terms of the design as they went through these different revisions and improved it over time. Looking at the actual change log for those revisions, which is available out there, there was a couple changes that they made throughout the life cycle. One of them was, what was it? I think it was this chip back here. Or no, it was this here, the 7404. Initially this was a Motorola branded chip. It ended up having stability problems. It has to do with the clock. It works directly with the crystals here and provides clock to a lot of different portions of the digital circuitry. And they had temperature issues with it under the Motorola version on there. So later they actually replaced it, and there was a service bulletin to swap it out to this Gold Star branded chip for the 7404. So you find that on both of these revisions here, that's actually Gold Star branded, not the Motorola branded. So if you have a really old board, you might see that as being or an old revision, I should say, that may be a Motorola branded chip on yours. So firmware upgrades. To upgrade firmware on these units, you want to look at these two EPROMs right here. These are your engine ROMs, same location on both boards. In this case, I've got version 3.54 installed on both. And if you look, the way that these stickers are, they don't match the existing setup ROMs are in here, which leads me to believe that these have already been upgraded at some point in the past. Date codes on them are 97, which was a lot later than most of the date codes on this unit as well. So somebody has upgraded both of these to 3.54 quite some time ago. So the latest version is 3.87. So to upgrade to 3.87, you just need to, find the ROMs. They're available online. dbwbp.com. Vincent that runs that site has got the best collection of free downloadable EPROM software that you can find. So I've contributed a lot of the actual ROM images that I have for various pieces of gear that he didn't have, and a ton of other people had as well. He's got a huge collection. It's all free. You can just download it. It's awesome. I definitely recommend going there to get this, and that's exactly where I went to get the 3.87 versions of these EPROMs. So to program these EPROMs, once you have the images, you can use pretty much any EPROM programmer out there. Any of the old school ones, will still work. I've talked about it before. I've got one of the little mini pros EPROM programmers that you can get. They're $60 or something like that on eBay or Amazon, and they work really, really well. Definitely recommend this. So, you can also just buy the ROMs. There's plenty of sellers on eBay and stuff that, they have the versions there. But for what they're charging, for a little bit more, you can buy the programmer and then buy some blank, EPROMs that you need to actually program it as well. And then you'll be set to upgrade, any other gear you own if you need to for very cheap, because you've already, invested into the programmer. And then, you can get, used EPROMs that are blank and just fine on eBay for, very, very cheap as well. Or even if you want to go the one-time programmable, ROMs, you can buy those from DigiKey or Mouse or whatever else, which are, perfectly compatible. It's just, they're one-time programmable. So, if you screw it up, it's kind of a wasted chip. But, they're brand new. But they're brand new, which is the, the benefit to it. Anyway, so to upgrade these, you may have a much older version of software on this, all the way back to like the 1.0 versions, which is the original EPROM, release for these units. And if that's the case, there will be one change on your board that you also need to make that involves these two jumpers right here. So what these two jumpers do is they basically enable the upper memory address line for each of these EPROMs, because as these grew in size in terms of the complexity of the firmware, it used more space. So originally these were 1 megabit EPROMs that they had in here, and ultimately as they moved on, up to the higher versions, including the 3.87 version, they had to upgrade to 4 megabit EPROMs to replace those with those in there. And to do that, they future-proof these designs because they knew that might be a cause. So these jumpers essentially enable that high-end, that next address bit on there. I think it's bit 19. I'd have to check. I can't remember offhand. By moving these jumpers, you actually enable that extra address bit, so you can address these larger size EPROMs, which is nice. Now on the older boards, these jumpers weren't always there. You actually just had solder pads in place that were unpopulated at the time. So in that case, what you'd actually have to do is solder a small wire between those jumpers to actually make this unit be able to see those large EPROMs. And in this case of this board here, as I mentioned, because somebody's upgraded in the past to 3.54, you can see that's exactly what's here. There's a small little piece of wire bridge between JP1, in this case pins I think 1 and 2. So if you have an older revision board like this and you do want to upgrade 3.87, you do have to put the jumpers in the locations that you see on both of these boards here. So EPROMs that you actually find in the units as it stands right now are typically 27C1001s, which I mentioned are 1 megabit EPROMs. Those are 128K by 8 bits to get your 1 megabyte of address space in there. So to put 3.87 on here, you need the next size up. You need to go to the 27C040s, which are these guys here. So these are 4 megabit EPROMs, they're 512K by 8 bits, and I've already gone ahead and programmed 2. So I'm going to drop these in this unit to actually upgrade it. So to remove the actual engine EPROMs or any EPROMs out of here, you can use one of these things. But I highly recommend not using these things. These things are terrible. They're garbage. The reason being is that as you're trying to actually have this on this, EPROM, it's a large chip, a lot of pins, and these sockets are usually pretty, they have a lot of resistance. It's stuck in there pretty good. If you're trying to pull that EPROM out just with this thing by rocking it, it's going to need a lot of force, and that's putting a lot of force on the board itself. And then when it finally gives way, it usually comes out rather violently because you got so much forward, upwards force on this that it's going to, end up just bending pins as it comes out, because it usually doesn't come out straight. So I don't know, if you like these, fine. I don't care. I don't. I always just recommend just using a small screwdriver and then just get underneath the chip, between the chip and the socket itself. Just gently twist it. Just kind of walk it up. Go down the actual EPROM all the way until you get the screwdriver down at the end there, and then just rock it again. And the chip will pretty much just fall out of the socket at that point. So that's the very safe way to do it. It's definitely the way that I recommend pulling, any of these chips out. So these are labeled high and low based on the addressing that they actually have, and it's the same true for the two that I burnt. So I put an H and an L on there so I know which is which, and just make sure as you insert them back in there that you keep them in the right orientation. So if you were to reverse them and put them the opposite of how they should be, it's not going to hurt anything, it's just not going to work. So when this unit boots up with the EPROMs in the wrong spot and it starts loading from address 0000, it's just going to crash at that point because it's going to read code and it doesn't make sense, and it's just going to halt. So it's not going to hurt anything. Again, it's just not going to work. So if that's the case, just swap them back to how they're supposed to go and you'll be fine. Orientation matters though. Don't put them backwards. That'll damage things. Now the setup ROMs, those are the second set of EPROMs that are on this board. So the setup ROMs are for the actual internal setups in terms of the sound banks and where sounds live based on the actual ROM samples that are on the factory onboard ROM. Now, I have not found a good source of information on all the exact revisions and versions of these actual setup ROMs in terms of all the different releases that were available for them. What I do know is that there's several different versions out there, and if you're adding additional modules in, like the orchestral module I have here on this daughter board, it came out of here, you need to make sure that you upgrade. Like if I were to plug this into this board right now, and, put it all back together, powered on, I wouldn't see anything. I wouldn't have any of these sounds or additional samples available. The orchestra sounds, I believe, go into the 900 banks, 800 and 900 banks of the K2000, and right now in this configuration, it's just not going to work. You need to update the setup ROMs, which basically tell the K2000R, hey, this sound bank is available here, here's the addresses it's at, and then it can actually have those sounds visible and usable by the actual user interface. So if I did want to put this from this orchestral module from the Kelvin version to the Janus version, I would have to update the setup ROMs on this unit to the ROMs that actually support this card. Now, the ones in here obviously supported it because they're in there right now, but it's counterintuitive because this is a version 1.0, this is version 1.3. But just be aware that if you want to update, your K2000 device with orchestra, or the contemporary modules, from one of these auto boards that becomes available, you need the proper setup ROMs as well to actually make these cards, work and visible in the system. Moving on to some other programmable devices on this board, down the front here you've got Godot and Pseudo. So both of these are basically lattice semiconductor GALs. So they're reprogrammable, programmable logic devices. So the GALs came out after the PALs. They're kind of a early version of like the modern CPLDs or even FPGAs you see today. But unlike an FPGA, you can actually you don't need a setup EPROM to load the software in here. These are actually reprogrammable themselves. So these do various functions on the K2000R. Specifically, they handle a lot of I/O addressing. Some of it's for SCSI, some of it's for other memory addressing, things like that. Kurzweil chose to use these in this device probably just because it replaced a handful of glue logic. Not having these programmable devices here, you probably would have had just a bunch of TTL series logic to handle all of your addressing and encoding and things like that for various functions on here. By using programmable devices as well, it allows them essentially to kind of rewrite, or reroute the hardware with updates, which is kind of cool. So the important thing about this is that the versions on here, version 5 for Godot and version 4 for Pseudo, those are the latest versions of these that were both released. Now, I can't find anywhere that has the software for these, but since I have the latest releases for these GALs, I actually already went ahead and read them. The little mini pro can actually read those GALs, which is nice. And I'll upload the configuration, basically, the bits that have the configurable combination logic in these to DB and WBP, like I mentioned before. So if anybody does need it, they can get it, and then you can still buy these. They're available on eBay. They're not expensive, a couple dollars to get a blank one, or just to use one for that matter, or even new old stock. And then if you have a mini pro, you can program it, and other programmers can program them as well. There's another one back here labeled S&D RAM, and then on the older Kelvin units you've got an MMU and an S&D MEM, so they consolidated some of that down with the new one. It has to do with memory management, obviously, but there's been no revisions to those chips as far as I know, so you don't really need to be concerned about them. So Godot is a lattice 20V8 device, and then Pseudo is a 16V8 device. So the numbers in the models on these indicate the number of inputs and outputs that you can actually use for both the combinational and somewhat state logic that's available in these devices. But GALs are really cool. They're fun to program, they're fun to play with, and there's still a lot of free old DOS-based tools out there you can use to actually program these. Next up is memory for the sample RAM. So these devices just use standard PC 30-pin SIMs. Nothing special about these. The only trick is that 30-pin is old. It's like, when was the last time anyone remembers actually using a machine with a 30-pin SIM in it? You're typically talking 386s and really early 486s at that point that used memory like this. So I have a lot of old memory that I saved over the years, and I'm going to go through it right now and just see what I have in terms of memory to upgrade these with. So for whatever reason, I saved RAM out of every machine basically I've ever come across. I don't know why. I think it was just because it was small and it was easy. At the time, RAM was so valuable back then that it was worth doing so. But anyway, the 30-pin stuff, most of this is 72. And 72-pin RAM is what the Kurzweil K2000R series uses. And as you can see, I've got a lot more of that. It was a lot more plentiful. This was used for a lot longer than the 30-pin stuff was. So the 30-pin, which I've got a bunch here. This is all 30-pin. The downside to 30-pin is typically it's never labeled with how big it actually is. And like modern RAM, it always says on it typically, how much it is. This older stuff doesn't. You typically would never find any labeling on there. So you gotta actually figure out how big each module is based on the chips itself. So the easiest way to do that is just to actually Google the actual RAM model number or the part number for the chip on there and see what size it comes up with. So for the 8 or 9-pin memory types, you'll come up and you'll see it's like 1 meg by 1 bit, which would be that individual chip. So then you see there's 8 bits on here, so it's actually 1 meg, 1 meg sim total, because you got the 8 bits times 1 meg. Sometimes you'll have a 9th chip for parity. You don't need that. The Kurzweils don't use it, but if you have 9 chip memory, it's not going to hurt anything. You can still use it in these units. For the 3-chip units, it's a little bit different. Typically these are 4-bit memory units, so you'll find something that's like 1 meg by 4 bit. So in memory like this, if it's the same across, it always isn't. Sometimes you'll have 2 4-bits and a 2-bit or whatever it might be on there. And the reason they do that is, so it's 1 meg times 4 plus another 4 bits, so that's your 8 bits. And then they needed 1 more bit for parity, so a lot of times they would use another 4, which is silly because you waste a lot of memory on there in terms of the 3 additional bits you're not even using. Or they'll use a smaller chip, that's like 1 bit or something like that, or 2 bits just to cover the parity for the parity type memory. So the other downside to this RAM, because it's so old, is most of what I have is pretty small in terms of the 30-pin variety. I've looked a few of these up, and most of what I have is 1 meg SIMs, which isn't great. There's actually a SIP module. So before SIMs, you had SIPs, which actually had pins. Those are really old machines. You never see that anymore, which is kind of funny. But anyway, so I looked up a few of the ones I have, and I've got a couple different pieces. I've got a couple different memory modules that are 1 meg that I can use in this. And you always need pairs. They go in pairs of 2, just like most older PCs, to get that 16 bits of memory space. But you can still buy 30-pin SIMs on eBay too. They're really not that expensive. If you wanted to max out your K2000 all the way to 64 megs of sample RAM, you can do still pretty reasonably, getting 4 16 meg 30-pin modules in there. The only type of memory you can't use, 30-pin memory you can't use in the K2000R, is composite memory. Composite memory is stuff that looks like this, where what they're doing, it's actually a pretty dense one there. What they're doing is they've got multiple banks of RAM chips on here, but then they've got actual other chips that are driving logic to address these, so you got multiple banks of RAM essentially on a single module. And typically the clocking of those additional chips and stuff like that can cause issues. And Kurzweil says specifically not to use composite memory in the K2000. Doesn't mean you can't try, doesn't mean it won't work, but since they have it so stated in there specifically, it was probably a reason why they had probably problems with a lot of it in these units. So since all I have in 30 pins is a couple 1 meg modules, I'm just going to throw those in here just to upgrade it. It's better than nothing. If I need more, I can always, like I said, look on eBay and just buy some 4 or 8 meg modules to increase it a little bit further. the way the banks are set up on these two, you got the two inner ones are a bank and the two outer ones a bank. So if you only have two sockets populated, you either have to use the inner two or the outer two. And like I said, they have to be in pairs. You can't just put one module in these things. Alright, I have the engine board reinstalled back in the K2000R, so we will power it on. And you can see there, 3.87J. So that is the firmware that's been updated. Now the biggest benefit of going to this latest version of firmware is SCSI performance. They improved SCSI's performance significantly, almost double, in terms of read and write times for pulling data in, both from external devices, hard drives, whatever it might be. So generally, anytime you update the firmware, you're going to want to do a hard reset on the unit as well. That way, you're not going to have any issues with anything that might be in program memory that was linked to the old version of firmware on here. So I don't have any batteries in here, so it doesn't make any difference to me in terms of resetting this device, but I'll do it anyway just to show what the process is. So under master, you go to reset, and then it'll ask you hard reset. This will delete everything, and you say yes. It'll ask you again, and then it actually goes through the reset process. And that's it. So obviously before you do this, back up anything you have in terms of what might be in program memory, because you will lose it when you do a firmware update. So alternately, if you're having issues with your device turning on where it's not booting properly, or there's memory corruption, otherwise it's preventing it from operating after you upgrade the actual software in it, there's a second way you can actually hardware reset this. You do that by holding the numerals 1, 2, and 3 while you power it on. And this will actually boot you into a diagnostic mode. So it gives you two options here, hard reset and diagnostics. Under diagnostics, there's a whole menu system there for testing basically every piece of hardware within this device, from the LCD to the front panels, the LEDs, the DSP engine, audio board. Like, there's all sorts of tests that go through and actually allow you to troubleshoot this, which is pretty cool. I'm going to cover that in a later video at some point, but I just wanted to mention it now. So hard reset is obviously the option you want to go through, so you hit enter on that. So you can see this message comes up, and it doesn't have the same series of questions as it did before. It's just basically at this point hard to reset. So power it off, and then back on. So next, just make sure it saw the RAM that I installed in there. So this unit did have 8 megs of RAM previously, and now you can see it's up to 10 megs of RAM. So those two 1 megs in there, bumped it up 2 megs. But not a big difference, but again, it's just free RAM that I have laying around, so I might as well just throw it in there for now. So back to the orchestral module and the setup ROMs. So this little daughter board that I've got the orchestral ROM module on, I pulled off, but they have it glued on there, and I don't feel like taking it off. There's just 4 additional little ROM chips on this board, but plugging this in with the default setup ROMs that I had in here, version 1.3, this won't actually, like I said, see the sounds that are available on here and set them up for the 900 numbered presets, or 900 available slots for programs on the Kurzweil. So what I had to do was I had to take the version 1.0 setup ROMs off of the board, the actual engine board that it came with the other Kurzweil I have, place them in to my 2500 or my 2000R, and then upon power up, I actually have those now available, because see, these setup ROMs, this version contains the information for the actual ROM samples in there, so Kurzweil can understand that and then place those sounds into the 900 series presets. So it seems counterintuitive, because the version on this version that was in here is version 1.3, and this is older version 1. But that's why I'm saying I don't have a perfect listing of all the different versions and iterations of the setup ROMs in terms of which actual modules they work with. What I will do is, since I have both of these available and I know these work with the orchestral module, I will read all these and again get them all uploaded to dbwpp.com, so they'll be available there in case somebody else needs them. So with these two version 1.0 setup ROMs, if you have the orchestral expansion, these two do go together and you will be able to use those sound samples. And here they are in the 900s, all the different actual sounds you get, or programs I should say, for those from that orchestral module. So I'm going to stop here. Firmware upgrades were the most important part of this video that I wanted to show. I wanted to try to squeeze some more stuff in, but it's already running long, so I'm going to pause. So I really wanted to talk about the SCSI to SD drive emulators, which, as you can see, I've actually already have one installed here. So I've already got all the footage for this pretty much recorded. I just need to edit it, so that video will be following this one pretty quick here. And that video will be pretty much exclusively just talking about that device, which is pretty cool. So again, if anybody has a full listing of all the setup ROMs along with the changelog that is associated with them, that would be super beneficial to know, A lot of other people I think would appreciate that a lot as well, so feel free to post that in the comments if you have that information. But besides that, hopefully this was beneficial, and thank you for watching.